Welcome to the Cypher Podcast, where we discuss all things sci and the paranormal through the lens of remote viewing. I'm Brett Stewart, accompanied by my co-hosts, Emily and David. And in today's show, we're doing a little bit of a throwback to a project I ran almost 8 to 9 years ago on the most significant presently undiscovered artifact in North America. So we're going to dive into details that came up in the original work all that time ago and also explore some new details. But before we get into our episode today, please head over to our website, cypher.com. That's PSIPHR.com. You can listen to our entire back catalog of free shows there. Additionally, we continue these podcasts in our premium after hours episodes that follow each show. Our subscribers help us keep the lights on, and it also provides a space where we can discuss some of the more controversial aspects of the topics that we investigate with remote viewing. We also regularly give away our premium shows from time to time, which you can access on our website just by registering a free account. And so with that, Emily, why don't we dive into this project, which I just coined back in the day? It was called Project Red Dog.
So for those of you who have been following Brett's work over the years, you may already be familiar with this Project Red Dog. It's something that Brett and I believe a team of his fellow remote viewers worked on for many years, starting back in, was it 2014, Brett? Was that around the time you began this work?
Yeah, it was around that era. Yep.
Well, I'll let Brett get into the backstory as to how he came up with this particular tasking and how he stumbled upon this particular artifact. But it seems to me like it may have actually been something that was surprising to not just Brett as the kind of project manager, but a lot of the people working on this project were quite unexpectedly surprised by what they found when they embarked on this work. Brett, do you want to share with us a little bit of the backstory for the listeners on how you came to do this project and take it from there?
Yeah, sure. So the kind of origin for this project began after I had started seeing my own remote viewing work start to match up to practice photos and other projects I had done really well. And so I started to progress beyond just a beginner remote viewer and more into the intermediate stage. I've been doing it for about 3 to 4 years by that point. And I was just walking one day wondering, how can remote viewing become more widely known and accepted by a larger audience of people? What could be done to help facilitate that? And I was just thinking, well, what if there's something that you could dig up, bring to the Smithsonian Museum and say, hey, check this out. We found this with remote viewing.
I think if you brought it to the Smithsonian, they would hide it in the secret basement and deny having ever seen it before.
It would join the ranks of all the other artifacts that they don't want everyone to know about.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, yeah, that's true. But that's what the general idea was. Could we find something that was newsworthy enough to get the attention of people who weren't necessarily interested in sci or the paranormal or consciousness or anything that we do, that it would shake their reality box just enough that they would potentially look into it? Or it's like, well, maybe we can go dig up this really ancient vase, or maybe there's an Egyptian artifact or something in North America that no one's found, and we can go to the newspapers with it. And that's kind of where this idea began.
To some extent, this is actually what Cypher Podcast is all about. If I can speak for myself and the co-hosts here, we are trying to, with this podcast, push the envelope of what people are comfortable with in terms of even contemplating and also understanding about our reality. We are definitely trying to broaden people's horizons in terms of what they're able to perceive and accept in their world.
I think that is something that we're all trying to share for people that are interested in hearing this type of content, to think, what if? I think Cypher helps facilitate that to some degree. I think, though, with Project Red Dog, it was, how do we take it even a step further than just, here's an interesting story, here's an interesting way to think about it, is what does that next step look like in terms of remote viewing? And there's this idea of ground truth, where you put your feet on the ground at a place, and then you say, aha, we've struck gold in the ground, so to speak. And that's was the idea behind this project. Could we find something really with remote viewing that was significant enough and then bring it back? And I think, well, as the old adage goes, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. Unfortunately, when I asked for the most significant presently undiscovered artifact, it wasn't just a little vase in the ground from perhaps an ancient culture. It was less movable, so to speak, because it was an entire complex of, well, underground features, as we'll get into here in a little moment.
So just for the audience, basically, I'm trying to explain in other words what I'm picturing you wanting to do, Brett. Is you wanted to be able to go out and kind of like remote view this really awesome object that would be just an earth-shattering revelation to the public, and then almost do like an Indiana Jones moment where you and a team maybe go out there and like actually find, and there'd be like no other way, because you're not archaeologists or anything, there'd be like no other way you could have found this particular item except through remote viewing. So you'd be like, here's this item. There's no way we would have just randomly known where to go in the middle of nowhere, but we did use remote viewing. So remote viewing's real, and we got this cool thing to show for it. Was that the whole idea?
That was the idea. And this was before I was aware that remote viewing has actually been used in the past to do this exact thing. I believe it was Stephen Schwartz and Hella Hamid. And Hella Hamid was part of the original SRI remote viewing group. She was the control. Because she was a photographer, and then the researchers at the Stanford Research Institute were like, we need someone who's not a natural psychic to come in and be our control subject to test for remote viewing. And that was Hella Hamid. She was just a friend of theirs. And she actually ended up being a really, really good remote viewer, surprisingly. And she did a project with Stephen Schwartz, but they found a temple that had been lost in Egypt. And they used remote viewing to go find it. And they went out and actually found it. And so perhaps it's the idea of ideas have people as opposed to people have ideas type of a thing. It was that exact kind of idea. It's like, oh, we could bring a film crew maybe and a couple people and go find the thing, dig it up, and then show that to the world that this is something that no one knew about, only was found through remote viewing. And isn't this a cool thing? Here's the interesting artifact. I still would like to do that someday, but it's not really a bringing back. It's more about going and exploring, is what it seems like.
There's something similar to that I saw done with animal communication and tracking using psi. There's this amazing lady, Anna Breitenbach, who's like an animal communicator, I think she describes herself as, and she works with wild animals who've got like behavioral issues or whatever. She's an animal psychic, basically. And she was with this guy who was a tracker who was using psi to find some rare animal. They took their TV crew and they're walking through the bush the whole day. And they get to the very end of the day and they've been following like this silver line appearing in this guy's psychic vision. And the film crew are starting to get like, oh, what are we doing? Right at the end of the day, they find whatever this animal was and have a nice little moment. But I mean, there's a documentary on YouTube. I'm afraid I can't remember what it's called, but you can go find it. Anna Breitenbach is her name, and it's a really cool, inspirational documentary which has that narrative going and finding something impossible using psi thing, and it hasn't changed the world. You know, I don't know. Is there anything extreme enough that we could do this and people would pay attention?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think that there's probably nothing extreme enough to shake everyone's reality box wide open to this idea of expanded consciousness and remote viewing and psi. That probably doesn't exist. But I bet if you had something that was to this effect, where if you could find an ancient artifact that was really significant and you showed the entire journey from beginning to end, and you actually found it, that it would have an impact on the culture. I wouldn't be surprised if it did.
Yeah, they would have that kind of thing on Netflix, right?
Yeah, sure.
I think you could get a, or the History Channel at least.
Maybe the History. I think Netflix, if it was a good enough show, would pick something like this up.
I guess regardless of what the intentions were originally that Brett and his team had, it seems to me like what they ended up getting was probably a little bit, they bit off more than they could chew, so to speak. And they did get some very interesting data that I'd like to get into and share with our audience here. But before we do that, Brett, can you actually clarify for us what was the actual, not mission statement, I guess, but the original cue that started this whole thing off? Can you share with us the actual wording of the original cue that led us into this particular artifact?
Yeah, the project was just called Red Dog, and that was just to keep the viewers blind to what they were looking at. The question that was being asked to the viewers that they remote viewed without any foreknowledge was, in North America, describe the most significant presently undiscovered artifact.
Okay, so with that, Brett, do you want to start us off with the site data that you got when you first did your remote viewing work on this project? Now almost, I guess, 8 years ago.
Yeah, so I have kind of a compilation of work because I actually remote viewed this tasking in different ways over about a 2-year period. First, it was a project that I ran with a bunch of other viewers. After that, I ran it at least 10 plus more times, probably from different angles, just describing the site, describing what it does, describing if I went there, what would happen, all this kind of stuff. And so my descriptions of the actual location that this most significant presently undiscovered artifact exists in, these always came back the same. And so the summaries that I'm going to give just for the sake of this podcast are kind of going to be a compilation of all of that work put together, just in a more neat form. So it wasn't like one session, here's what I got. It's more of like I'm distilling 15 to 20 sessions down as simply as I can. So just so people are aware of that. I describe the site as a wide natural expanse of land. It is untouched and uninhabited, with sparse ground cover consisting of mostly rock, mud, and sand. The climate is cool and damp, and this location was once populated but has since been forgotten. There is a sinkhole at the site that is surrounded by a semi-enclosed overhang resembling a cavern. There is a trailhead here that appears to lead to the target, which was purposely hidden from view in plain sight. There is something like an illusion or a mirage that is obscuring the entrance. The undiscovered artifact is located in this protected underground area.
So when I remote viewed this site, obviously I was blind. At some point, I asked myself, where on planet Earth is this? And did some blind map dowsing to locate it. And I actually got a location in northern Siberia. It's like 20 degrees latitude further north than the location that Brett's work has narrowed it down to. But interestingly, it's exactly the same kind of landscape. It's like mountains and scrubby tundra, patches of trees, these pools and sinkholes. I think is that the Arctic permafrost or something, that you get these bubbles under the ground and then it melts and it collapses. So it's a really distinctive looking landscape. And it's an interesting aside about doing geolocation with remote viewing, that there seems to be a kind of laziness, a matching effect that goes on. I've run a few experiments with other viewers on this, where you pick a location, and I think I picked like the most northerly IKEA store, so somewhere in Scandinavia, somewhere cold and snowy, and the viewer came back and said it's in Alaska. So they're like matching the weather conditions and the kind of landscape and everything, but seemingly just picking locations on planet Earth at random that look kind of like the site. So it's a really weird bug with remote viewing, that we know what the site looks like, we can match to it, we can find places on Earth and name them, but we can't always just do it all at once.
Yeah, remote viewing, the strength that it has is more in the descriptive work I've found than the actual locational work. Not that you can't actually use it for locational work. It's just it has a little bit more bugginess to it, I would say, than the descriptive work. So it's pretty interesting that after all these years, David, that you got the exact same type of environment that all those years ago when we first ran it, it just matches 1-to-1. It's this tundra, sandy, sparse, low ground cover type of environment with a lot of sinkholes.
Oh yeah. I've drawn a map of it with the road coming off, the road to nowhere, I said. Goes past these trees into a portal, it goes underground, and even drew some nice mountains next to it.
So, David, even though you had a different location than I guess Brett's team had gotten, it's interesting you had the same land features, but I'm very curious to know, Brett, how did you manage to, given all these difficulties with actual geolocation, how did you and your team manage to pinpoint this location, which I assume you have done? How did you do that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting story, actually, because there are different techniques in remote viewing that you can apply to get general areas of the location. So the first thing you can do is you can describe significant landmarks. You can describe what's around it, what type of land features. You can use target prompts that move your perception up into the sky, like say 5 miles in the sky, and describe what's below you. And so we did all these types of things. And then there's also other work you can do that is using coordinates and in certain types of triangulation using remote viewing. It's a very nuanced technique. It's not perfect, but it does tend to get you in the right area at the very least. And so all this work, which was also done blind, the viewers had no idea what they were viewing. It all pointed up north, the cold north of the American border in the tundra region that you find in North America.
So in order to do this, you would tell the viewers, like, move to point A and then tell me the direction and the distance to the site, and then go to point B and kind of draw lines on a map and see where they cross?
It's similar to that. The way the triangulation method works is you take a known site to the tasker, not to the viewer. And from a fixed point, you say, okay, what at this site should I be drawing a line through to where the target is? And so is it that building over there that's really unique? That's to the north. Is it the lake that's to the south from this fixed point that's established in the question? And then you do that from 3 different points in a large area. Maybe, because we were starting with all of North America, we had to start like down in LA. Another one of these sessions was run over in Florida, and then another one up in Canada. And then we basically draw the lines and we get where's the general direction we're looking? And all the viewers kept pointing up into this specific region up in Canada that matched all the site data that we were describing of it's a tundra, cold. It has this kind of frost during the winter, everything snows over. And then during the warmer months, it actually melts, but not really totally, but there are all these pools everywhere. So not a lot of trees and not a lot of large features other than just rock and tundra, mud and sand.
Yeah, the Canadian Arctic is a massive, massive area, and it does look very similar in large swaths of it. So it's not like in a city environment where you can easily identify landmarks and stuff. You're basically it's miles and miles and miles of wilderness where there are no people around. There's not even roads really. A lot of those places are only accessible by like a little seaplane that can land on a lake because there aren't even airports. So
yep, most of these areas up there you cannot even drive to. You have to fly in, and then there's these little tiny towns that are fishing towns out there that you have vehicles and you can hike or take a boat depending on where you are to get around, but it's very difficult to actually get around up there.
I mean, this is crazy isolated, and I really picked up in that on my remote viewing session. And I thought we're in the middle of like Arctic nowhere. There's a road to nowhere. There's this hidden underground thing. I thought I'd been tasked to go look at like a Cold War missile silo, and I'm like, should we be doing this? I don't think we're supposed to be like harming national security by doing this. Especially, we'll go on to it shortly. I think what's actually there at the site. There's some very energetic and weird stuff, and I just got this idea stuck in my head, like, oh my god, is this a nuclear warhead? We shouldn't be doing this. What have you done? Why have you sent me here?
Emily has tasked us to look up all the Russian sites.
Yeah, the other interesting part about the actual location and the work we did, not just on the descriptive aspects of what's around it, but I have a really short story that was interesting that I could share about where it is. And this has to do more with traditional psychical functioning and this was maybe a year after I had done the project. And I'd gone up to Idaho. Part of my family has a house, and I was meeting with my niece, and she is a really, really great natural psychic. She does a lot of dowsing. She does tarot. She does a lot of different things, and she's really, really good at it. And I was describing this work to her that I'd done, this interesting remote viewing project. And as I was doing it, she was like, I see it in real time right now. And she started describing the most significant land feature right next to this location, which I can say because there's so many of these, but she described where all of our work was pointing to. It was right next to an enormous waterfall, a series of waterfalls. And she was seeing there's like this hidden entrance in this mountain next to these enormous waterfalls. And it's like if you were there, you wouldn't even think to walk through it. And I hadn't even explained to her that this is actually in the data, and she's getting this in real time as I just say I did an interesting remote viewing project. So it was a fun kind of corroborating piece of information from a really good psychic that I know that also I happen to be related to.
So are you saying that the entrance is literally behind a waterfall? Isn't that too much of a movie trope?
No, it's not behind a waterfall but it is directly next to one as far as what I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, I got mountains directly next to the site when I drew my little map. So
Brett, from what I saw reading through your data on this project, it does seem like you were describing some sort of almost like you'd think out of a sci-fi movie, like a force field hologram, sort of a fake rock facade. Like I'm thinking like something out of Star Trek where you say the magic words and like the facade disappears and there's a door behind it that opens up almost like you're leaving the holodeck or something like this. That's what came to my mind when I was reading your work.
The actual sketches of the entrance to the site, because this is an entrance, that the artifact is in an underground area, which I think we'll go into here in a minute. But to actually access this area, my drawings, and it seems like yours as well, David, is there's a mountain, and then in the side of a mountain, there's a natural face, naturally drawn from. And then there's this words in the remote viewing data were like a cloaking device, like a force field or some sort of barrier that prevents something from being seen. But there's a hole in the side of the mountain, though if you were standing right next to it, it's like the high level data was, it's right there. No, it's right there. But you wouldn't see it if you were standing right in front of it.
I said that it's actually amusing because of the incongruity between what it looks like and what it actually is. That it's disguised, it's hidden in plain sight, and it's pretending to be something else. I had this visual, you know, on aeroplanes, the little air vents that are like a truncated cone shape that are up in the top that you can direct it around. That was the shape of this thing, this kind of truncated cone with the lines up the side. I'm not quite sure which bit opens. There's a sort of counter-rotating opening up thing to do with this cone-shaped thing, but I had listing out the most significant tangibles at the site. I said there's this old structure that's like wooden, dilapidated. I had an AOL of an old church. And I think maybe because I had this Cold War missile silo idea in my head, I was thinking like, is the entryway hidden in there? So, I mean, that may have colored my data a bit, that it seemed like there was maybe a man-made or, you know, there's the remains of man-made structures there. And then this thing is hidden amongst them. Almost like, you know, there's the idea of, oh, you go and find the old beaten down barn and it just looks like it's about to fall down, and you open the doors and inside there's like the high-tech secure steel doors that go into the secret military bunker. It was that kind of thing where there's this facade over this grubby, dilapidated exterior.
Brett, did you get a sense of how old this particular artifact or structure is? I mean, we're talking a lot here about man-made and old and dilapidated, but the sense I was getting was this thing is very, very old. In other words, nothing wooden, nothing people could make in modern times would have outlasted this thing. This thing seemed to me like it's like tens of thousands of years old. I don't, you may not know exactly, but it doesn't seem like it's even hundreds or even thousands. We're talking like tens of thousands as an order of magnitude, right?
Yeah, this is the location that was once populated, but has since been forgotten. So it's not in recorded history. So at that point, we're probably thinking tens of thousands of years in ancient past. But the materials itself, actually, it's in the remote viewing work to describe it, is that the entrance itself is described as being made out of a composite material that's incredibly durable. And it's something that has been constructed. It's inset in the side of a cliff face somehow, and it's hiding. It's like there's this idea behind it which says, prove your worth. It's like, can you figure this out? Oh, you can? Oh, well, then that if you can figure this out, maybe you can figure out what's beyond it.
I got some data that supports that kind of prove your worth idea. Maybe I was retasked to go look more into the door mechanism, and it seemed pretty boring. I had an AOL of industrial and wires, that there's closed loop control, maintaining a programmed output. It was almost like your automatic garage door or something. You know, it was not a complex system, but it was engineered and it was constantly kind of monitoring itself and controlling its state. Interestingly, if you ever go there, watch out, because I said it changes state after a set time, like an automatic door will close after you. So maybe once you're in, that's it. Take plenty of food. And I said about the operating procedure, the design rules are boring and mundane and unexceptional. It's a door, right? But there is a challenge and response to this mechanism. And I didn't dig into that. I don't know whether you have to say the password or what, but there's some kind of to and fro which has to go on outside that door.
There's something about the site in general, not just the entrance, but even the artifact itself, that is directly tied into this idea of prove your worth. That not just anybody could go to this place, that even if they knew it was there, that they'd be able to get in, or even if they were able to get in, that they'd be able to interact with what's there. I think that there are some safeguards that whoever built this place put kind of inherent in the design to make sure that the place wasn't easily found, or then, if found, misused.
And just to clarify for the audience, when you say worth, you're not talking about money. You're talking about almost a, for lack of a better word, a sort of a spiritual worth, or sort of a consciousness level that you've attained for yourself that would allow you to access these things. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's talking about your state of consciousness. And so it's prove that you're ready to handle what's beyond this, not are you rich enough? I think, David, you had some stuff at one point where there were people or someone was looking at this thing like they had found it, but nothing was working for them. So they're like, yeah, well, okay.
Well, they seem like scientists. I don't know when this was, because I tasked myself to move to the peak operation time. So whenever I landed at the target, it was like dusty and nothing was happening. It was kind of just quiet, dormant. So I said, all right, let's go somewhere where it's doing whatever it's doing the most, which I find interesting that it wasn't what we're going to talk about later. It wasn't doing its intended purpose, right? So I think maybe this thing has never actually operated based on my data. But at some point, and it occurred to me yesterday when I was looking back through my session, this could be in the future, because I didn't check. I just said, let's go to when it's doing the most of whatever it is it does. And I said, the scientists here, let's talk to one of them. And we had a little conversation. And I said, what have you achieved so far? And they said, well, we've measured some anomalies, but we need to work out how to make them bigger and more powerful. It's frustrating. We're working in the dark. We don't have any idea how this works.
This harkens back to Skinwalker Ranch. It seems like there's lots of really old things that scientists poke at and they have no idea what they're doing and they don't seem to do anything, and yet they're weird and they're observing all sorts of anomalies, but it's almost like they're stabbing in the dark. So I think we've painted a pretty good picture here of the site itself, the general sort of outside environment that it's in, and how one might enter or get into the site location. But I think the actual artifact is inside of a cavernous structure. And maybe, David, you want to lead us off with what you found in your data that describes both the sort of inside of the site and then what you saw in there?
So I got the land. It's a sloping land. We have this hidden door somewhere, and then there's a domed covering over top. I guess maybe this is an artificial cavern or an existing cavern or something, but there's big open space underground, which is kind of what got me thinking this is a missile silo, because there's some structures closer to the ground with this central. I mean, on my sketch it's just a triangle, but I know Brett's data describes it as a pyramid, I think, with the chair that you sit in it. But I've just drawn a little triangle here and gone down. I was attracted down below this to another pyramid or cone thing, and at the peak of this there's this really interesting object this is what gave me the AOL of it being a nuclear warhead. What I saw was I mean, I suppose about the size of a football, maybe a little bigger, but this black, faceted, dark crystal thing, and there's kind of something going on inside it. I said it's a time periodic change. It's consistent, like a clock's ticking. It's faceted. And then I hit loads of AOLs of like nuclear decay and stuff, because it kind of is like that. There's this ticking, energetic, not ticking like a clock, but there's this like cyclical activity going on with it, within it. So I located this crystal, I think, at the outset, because I was going, well, we're in the middle of the tundra here. There's nothing here. You can't connect to the power grid. Where's the power source for this? Because I know, like in the Cold War era, there were weather monitoring stations. I know Russian ones, perhaps US ones and others as well, that were using nuclear electricity generators. But they have like plutonium inside them that just stays really hot. And then they use a Stirling engine to turn that heat to spin a generator. So they're kind of like a super long-term, reliable power source. I think they use them on the International Space Station too, these things. They're really cool, but then obviously they got left lying around in the Arctic and they started becoming really hazardous. So they had to go around and find all these things and collect them. But I was thinking maybe there'll be something like that, right? There'll be something keeping the lights on at this site. And then I found this weird crystal. So later on, I go back, look at the power source, I'm doing air quotes there, the power source and associated structures. What's the purpose of it? And I've drawn like a symbolic sketch of this floating triangle thing on top of a pyramid in a big hole in the ground, wrote the word clandestine under it. And then next to it, I've just written, I have no idea what I'm looking at here. This was so weird and unusual. And despite the fact that I had this kind of idea in my head, like, oh, it's a nuclear bunker or something, it was really hard to make sense of. I mean, this was a long session I did on this, and I could have done a lot more. I was disappointed when I got feedback, because I would have liked to have explored this target more.
David always wants to do more session work on the really interesting targets. And it's funny, this happens even when it's like, I could have done 5 more sessions. We could have solved all the mysteries of the universe. But at some point you have to say, we got to record a show.
Exactly. We can always do follow-ons on the projects that are seeming very fruitful or interesting. But at some point you have to pull the plug and just with some sort of a report to you, the lovely listeners. So,
well, I saw your video on YouTube when you first put it out in, was it 2018 or before?
Might have been 2018 or 2017, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. I saw it when it was up anyway. So when I got the feedback, I was like, wow, it was that. That was really fun. So I'd kind of been wondering whether I would ever end up viewing this target. So
the original session data that I got and in the projects that I ran prior to what David got, obviously, it corroborates identically to what the actual target or the artifact itself is. It seems to be a feature that is inside of this sinkhole. There's this huge underground opening that has a semi-enclosed kind of dome ceiling above it, very similar to what you described, David. But inside this massive cavern, there are actually man-made structures. And there's a particularly prominent one that looks like a pyramid. However, there's something at the very top of this pyramid that creates, well, it's what the artifact is, and it interacts with stuff that is inside the pyramid, but it creates a really interesting experience for those who are able to interact with it.
I just want to clarify for the listener, when Brett says man-made structure, it's kind of a technical term that we use in remote viewing. It doesn't necessarily mean even humans made it, although it could or could not be that in this case. It just means it was something that was intentionally formed by conscious beings, and it wasn't formed by sort of natural processes like we'd think of like erosion or volcanism or something like this. Is that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's what you mean, Brett?
It is.
I mean, you could say artificial instead, right? But maybe that's a little broader.
Yeah, you could use artificial. Man-made is just kind of a short term in remote viewing to reference anything that's not natural. It's just a conscious intelligence made this. It wasn't something that just happened by itself spontaneously. But the actual artifact that I described in the work and is in all this other project work, I'll just read this brief summary, is that this target is an exotic, man-made transformation device. And I think in After Hours, we're going to go into what type of transformation that actually ensues. But they've got some pretty interesting details that corroborate the original work. But the artifact itself was designed with a capacity for consciousness and has an organized intelligence. However, this brain-like system appears to be detached when not in use. It acts as a monitor for Q&A sessions when someone is interacting with it. It is an autonomous series of instructions, similar to a computer program, which has been embedded within an operating procedure of the device. Internally, it has a crystalline appearance, and if you were to visually see it, it would look similar and have a reflective nature like abalone shells. So it's a crystal that has been programmed in some way for a very specific purpose.
What you described there reminds me a little bit of what I would think of as sort of an AI. However, unlike the AI that we'd have in our time, this AI is almost like on a not a physical level necessarily, it's more on a consciousness level. It's like a consciousness AI. So there'd be this distinction between a conscious being that would just be like waiting around and bored to tears for millennia while nobody's interacting versus it's more of a consciousness program. Does that make sense the way I've described it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it is something like that. And it's funny because now I'm just reminded of our episode on Thoth, where he's talking about crystals and how to interact with crystals. And he's like, you should speak with it and interact with it as if it's conscious. It's not. But by dint of acting with it that way, it can lead to very interesting positive results. So I think perhaps, well, even when we looked at who made this and how it was made, the work comes back pointing out that a lot of people, through sustained conscious intent, put their energy and intention, conscious intention, on this object. And it's like it just arose out of that process. Like it wasn't made, it was born, is a more appropriate way to describe how this thing came to be, even though it's a physical object that appears crystalline in nature.
So I tried to look at where this thing came from. I've drawn a timeline as just like a huge arrow, and it's like a hole is made and something is put in to this main thread, this main story, which has just occurred to me now that this kind of could come from outside of time or some kind of screwy dimensional thing that we don't have words for and definitely don't understand. So I'd drawn this big arrow that the target was inserted into a little gap in. So I said, what does this arrow represent? And then I drew a planet. So I think this is inserted into the timeline of Earth. What we can make of that, I don't know, but it's interesting.
So I didn't know if we would go here with this conversation, but there's other work that's outside this project that I've done. And this is very, very metaphysical. This is super out there. I have no feedbackable information for any of this type of stuff. But there's an idea, and it actually has arisen in popular culture, actually more recently. But there's an idea that exists that within physical reality itself, there are certain structures or artifacts that were left intentionally scattered around for those that could find them, and that they would give certain benefits to beings that found them. And I always wondered if this was something like that, that let's take the universe itself and imagine for just a moment that this isn't random, that there was a purpose. There is a bigger plan that's going on with reality, especially with Earth, physical reality that we're experiencing here, and that someone or some intelligence had an overarching story that they wanted to play out. Would it be possible, hypothetically, that they left little breadcrumbs or little, perhaps, power-ups sitting around for those that could find them, that would help them on the creation of this story? And could this be one of those? This is a pretty wild story, but what you're describing matches that kind of data that I've seen elsewhere. And I always wondered if Project Red Dog was one of those things.
Well, I described it as a intervention or interjection. So it may be a third party change that's made. I also described it as like an Easter egg in the timeline. Like, remember you could play pinball in Excel 95? It's kind of like that. You can unlock hidden Excel pinball of planet Earth.
Yeah, the work that I've done that looked into the purpose of why this thing was even made in the first place. What came out of that work was a little unexpected, but it matches this hypothesis that maybe this is something that was a leftover or remnant from outside of time before this game of Earth or this what we're experiencing here even started. It described the location and the artifact itself as kind of an escape hatch where there was a narrative, a story that played out in the remote viewing work, where there was a group of beings that were leaving. And they believed that potentially that there's some of their group would not be able to make it out with them. And so they created this thing that would act as a lifeboat for them to meet up and to re-meet whoever these original creators were. And so it's very metaphorical, and what it actually means in physical reality, I'm really not sure. But the metaphor it's apt to kind of think what we're discussing here.
You say it's an escape hatch. What might those people be escaping from?
Maybe you have to ask them, but I think it might have something to do with the game we're playing here on Earth and physical reality.
That sounds to me like an after hours conversation.
It does. It does.
David, I'm curious, did you see any other site elements that we haven't yet discussed that really jumped out at you that were significant and interesting about this site in particular?
Yeah, I did, although I still don't know what to make of them. When I looked at the power source, I said that it reaches out or it links and relates to a remote location. So I asked what's the nature of the relationship. It's drawing inwards, like how electrons stream up from the ground before lightning strikes. It's flowing like water. And then got into this stuff about, I think this is an analogy of the idea that observing a system can affect it, and that there's a time element to this, which I had a real visceral feeling of glitching in time. It's an effect that's sometimes used in like music videos and movies and stuff where you kind of jump around in time a little bit and it gives this very jerky, janky feeling to the scene. That's what I was experiencing in my session, that something really weird is going on. It's at the quantum level or to do with time or something. I couldn't make any sense of it. It felt extremely weird and unfamiliar to me, though, so I don't know how to interpret this. I also, coming off this observation affecting the event or affecting what is observed thing, I had this idea of spooky action at a distance, that things are being affected elsewhere without this site, and presumably the big spooky crystal thing, having anything obviously to do with it. And then I said there's this twitching, glitching, time glitching feeling again, and it's disrupting. It's actually disrupting the Earth in a resonant, liquefying, vibrating way. And I had an AOL of Tesla's supposed doomsday machine because it was so powerful and so weird. I said it was liquefying disruptions in the Earth, but the structure is not evidently the cause of this. It was super weird. I'm afraid I don't know what to make from that.
Well, I think we're gonna, in the After Hours show, go into the interaction process and what else is there, because inside this underground pyramid, for lack of a better word, there's actually an interface for someone to hook in to some extent to the processes that this artifact seems to be able to facilitate. That is really strange energy. It has some really strange consequences and effects on the person that's interacting with it, if they're able to even interact with it, which is another interesting point. But right now, the big takeaway for me is that ultimately, when I asked this original question, which was, I just want this artifact and let's bring it back and we'll show it to the Smithsonian. And so interesting, remote viewing worked, is we actually ended up on something that seems to have cosmic significance, not just North American significance, is that there's something here that's way bigger than any of us realized until we started diving into it and remote viewing it. Because what can occur, what can happen if you interact with this device successfully, it's pretty significant as far as what the outcome could be.
One of the things I've learned through not just this particular episode, but even going back to some of our previous episodes, the one that sticks out in my mind the most is Olympus Mons. There's definitely this element of be careful what you wish for, or be careful where you sort of stick your nose, because what you could find is way beyond what you could even expect to find. Like, even if you're out there trying to find some woo or something really strange, you have to be prepared that the thing you actually end up finding is way stranger and way farther out of your reality box than what you even thought was possible. So you have to be prepared to have your worldview sort of shattered as you're adventuring out into these different topics.
I actually had those very words in one of my sessions when we did Bigfoot, that I probed, like, what's the spiritual context or background to this? And I kind of got zapped in the head, and the data, be careful what you wish for, came out onto the page. Like, you sure you want to go there? So I said, no, I don't, probably. Let's move on.
Well, I mean, when we finally put together the expedition to go this place, you are the expert archaeologist, David. So I don't know, are you joining the team?
I'm not sure what use an archaeologist is going to be in the context of this. I could bring my little trowel.
Yeah, there you go.
We could draw some dirt and take very accurate measurements of dirt.
Someone's got to take the little brush and brush off the entrance.
Oh, archaeologists in the UK at least never use brushes because it's always too wet. Just smears everything around, makes a mess. It's all about the little trowels.
Well, I think this is a good place to wrap up this main show for Project Red Dog and the most significant presently undiscovered artifact in North America. We're going to continue this discussion in after hours for our subscribing members. If you are not a subscriber, definitely head over to our website, Cypher.com. That's PSIPHR.com. And you can sign up. You'll get access to our entire back catalog of after hours episodes where we go beyond the main show into a lot more of our personal theories, some of the more controversial data that we don't just let out into the public. So it also supports us. It helps us keep the lights on. So if that's something you would love to do, become a subscriber, head over there and sign up. Also, we would love any type of review on Apple Podcast. Give us a 5-star rating. All those things help us out and reach more people with the show. And so with that, I think that concludes this episode. We will see you in the next one, everybody. Take care.